Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome to another Tabletops and Taverns, the series in which I talk about topics relevant to tabletop role-playing games. This episode, we're going to take a look at a basic element of role-playing games, adventure design. It's a subject I've been asked about a few times, not as much as I've been asked about some other subjects, but it's fundamental enough that I felt it appropriate to address it in a video, if only to lay out the groundwork for other videos. And hopefully, if I get any people that have need of this, new dungeon masters, people who just don't like designing their own adventures because they don't really know how to go about it, hopefully this will be of a little bit of help to them. First of all, what's an adventure? An adventure is a scenario in which the characters face a challenge and hopefully, for their sake, overcome it, or at least survive it, because you can't win them all, and if you can at least walk away, that's a win. Adventures can be standalone or part of a greater campaign arc, and we will touch on campaigns and storylines in other episodes, but for this particular one, we're just going to focus on the individual adventures themselves. Now, we'll be mentioning campaigns quite a bit because it does determine some elements of how to design a particular adventure, but it's not going to be my main focus. We're not going to talk about linking them in. That's going to be a topic for another time. Now, there are as many ways to design adventures as there are dungeon masters out there. Everybody has their own technique, and the best practices change not only over the years that have been passed, but also between games and even between iterations of games. Designing an adventure for, say, first edition AD&D is going to be a lot different from designing it for 4th edition. So this can't be a definitive guide to adventure design. This is just going to be basically taking a look at some of the general considerations of adventure design, their implications, and my personal method for adventure design overall. Now, I'm not going to touch on the specifics to design adventures of a particular type, because we could go on for days and days that way. But I'm going to bring as much as I can that's going to be relatively useful in a very general way. Now, for purposes of this particular video, I'm going to be focusing on Dungeons & Dragons and other fantasy role-playing games, those sorts of adventures. Although many of the topics are equally applicable to any game system and genre. So if you hear me refer to a dungeon, you can mentally sub in an abandoned spaceship, or a mega corporation headquarters, or whatever fits your particular deal. Now, I should mention right here that going forward here, how much effort and detail you put into your adventure design will vary based on your needs. So the degree to which you develop everything I'm about to say is gonna be dependent on what you're actually designing. An adventure design for eventual publication is going to require a lot more detailed effort and work than an adventure thrown together in an afternoon as a pickup game for a couple friends that just came over. I'm going to go out on a limb here and assume that if you're developing adventures for final publication, you've probably got better things to do than watch an introductory video on the matter from a third-rate YouTuber. So I'm going to focus on those preparing adventures for their particular home group. Now, before sketching out any ideas about the adventure, you have to have some basic things settled ahead of time. And I know some of these are going to sound stupid, they're going to sound pretty trite, but I've been stung by them before. For instance, the first thing you have to settle is, what game system are you going to use? And if you've already got a group and you've got something set up and they've all agreed on a particular game system, then that's solved already. That's your game system. I, for instance, have designed an adventure for a particular system, got to a place and the makeup of the group changed a little bit, and they decided, hey, we don't want to play that particular system, we want to play this one. And I've had to either scrap the entire adventure or quickly adapt it to a different rule set. And yeah, it can be really annoying to do that. Um, as far as other particulars, you'll need to know the target character level and group size. The group size is going to be how many players you got, your character level. Some game systems don't have character levels, but even those that don't generally give you a way to measure a character's ability. So basically, you're looking at the overall power level of the party that you're going to be designing it for. It's going to give you a range of challenges that you can put there. Then, the challenge level of the adventure itself should be considered as an entirely separate entity, because it's possible to have adventures that are relatively difficult or easy, both tied, both targeted towards the same number of players at the same level. An adventure that is just starting a campaign story arc, or one that's just designing new, or just designed to introduce new characters into a particular setting, or something that's designed to be sort of filler, is going to be maybe a little bit easier than one that covers infiltrating the final layer of the main story arc's villain, or a major turning point in a war that's going to change the entire setting. Those are going to be relatively more difficult, even though they may be tied, they may be aimed at the same character level and group size, but their relative difficulties are going to be a little bit different. Let's see, adventure tone. Now, if you've got a campaign, your overall genre is going to set the tone for most of your adventures. But if you're running a one-shot, you're going to have to decide what tone the adventure is going to take. You're also good, even if you're running a long-term story arc, you might throw an adventure or two in that don't meet the overall genre expectations of the rest of the campaign. Your characters may take a side trip and from a grand high fantasy campaign and encounter a vampire's castle or something, and then you're going to veer more towards horror. Or they may encounter the aftermath of a battlefield in a poor village, and it's going to be a little bit more gritty and more, more down to earth kind of adventure from that, and verge from the overall story arc. If you're doing a one shot, or if you're doing something just off the cuff, then the adventure's tone is basically going to set your genre. So that's something to consider, because it's going to basically kind of give you a nudge in terms of what you're going to want to focus on in terms of monsters, in terms of NPCs, in terms of overall description. And it's going to help speed the design process. If you know right up front, I'm going to design an adventure that is horror, I'm going to design an adventure that is high fantasy, design an adventure that is political, or design an adventure that is maybe a murder investigation. So that's going to set the whole thing in. It's going to smooth things over. So once you've got those basics down, the target level and group size, the relative adventure difficulty, whether it's going to be part of an ongoing campaign, the overall tone, it's time to start thinking about the specific adventure itself. Most adventures start with the kernel or the seed of an idea. A DM may decide on a cool setting that they want to use, or a particular encounter that they want to see, and then design the adventure around that. They might think of about a theme that they want to touch on, even though they don't know the specifics about how they're going to touch on it, and then work from there. This kernel, this seed, this adventure seed, is going to become the star of the adventures. Now, the actual stars are going to be the player characters when it comes down to running it. But from the player character's point of view, they're going to want something that's going to have like grand billing or whatever that's going to attract them to the adventure. It's going to make the adventure memorable. Whether it be a grand castle that's going to stick out in their mind, or a great villain, a memorable setup or a mechanic that's put into the adventure that is going to make them think about it in the future and generally have fun. And that's going to be your main focus of the adventure. Some may have 2 or 3 seeds, but in general, those are going to be the ones about which the entire adventure is going to be built up. Some of the adventures are just filler. Some of them do not. Some of them have kind of forgettable stars and such, and are just used kind of to fill the time. And honestly, that's okay too, as long as your group doesn't get bored. Some groups have all the fun in the world just kicking in the door of a dungeon and going in and fighting goblins and then going to the next door and so on and so forth. But even then, you've got a seed of an adventure, and that seed is the dungeon itself. So the dungeon itself is the star of that particular adventure. So once you've got your adventure seed, there are some specific elements of the adventure that you want to touch on next. Whether it be in the antagonist or the setting, whatever. Put your seed there, and then write down as many details as you can about the adventure seed first. If your star is the adventure seed is the antagonist himself, make note not only of the things like their class, species, their overall demeanor, their desired abilities, but also the intangible things. Ideas for their motivations, for their background, their relationships with the player characters and other NPCs, notes on where they might call home, that sort of thing. Generally speaking, your main seed of the adventure is going to be everything you'd want to know if you were going to play the villain or whatever as an actual player character rather than just a generic NPC. If the star of your adventure is the dungeon or another specific setting, you don't have to map it out right away, but at this point you want to get a good idea of the things you want to see in it. Special rooms you might want in a particular castle, areas of the dungeon or a haunted forest that you might want to touch on. Any really wicked ideas for traps or landmarks that you really want to incorporate, go ahead and jot them down. Always write them down, because keeping an entire adventure design in your head is going to quickly lead to lost details unless you've got an absolute perfect memory. And nobody I know personally has an absolutely perfect memory. May think they do, but they always leave a couple things out. One thing that's helpful for writing stuff down, or one thing that writing stuff down is helpful for, is that if you end up not using a particular trap, or you're not using a particular element of that particular adventure, then when you're designing future adventures and you're looking for ideas, you can always refer to the initial notes of your old adventures and say, I didn't use that particular trap, or I didn't use that particular background for an NPC, so I'll use it in this new one. And you can go back and mine your old ideas for new content. One thing that you shouldn't do at this point is assume that everything you've written down at this point is set in stone. In the writing world, this is basically the notes for your first draft, and it's like the brainstorming session. So just because you've put it down now doesn't necessarily mean there's going to make it in the final cut. Once you're satisfied with the details of the seed of the adventure, or the star of the adventure, then you have to sketch out the rest of the details for the adventure. And this is going to take a little bit of time. It's where the most of the time is taken. At a bare minimum, many adventures can have many different parts to them, but at a bare minimum, an adventure should have a main antagonist, not necessarily a villain, but an individual, a group, whatever, to provide the challenge to the party that they must overcome. A adventure must have an adventure hook, the thing that gets the player characters involved in the adventure. It's the starting point, so if you don't have that, they ain't going to get involved. The adventure should have a setting consisting of the lands and structures that the adventure encompasses, which may or may not include a home base for the adventurers. It should include potential allies or resources the party can acquire, things to help them along, or at the very least provide a backup assistance, or even just a clue as to how to proceed. And then finally, a plot. And I know people are going to say, oh, you put the plot in last, but the plot, and I put it in last, but I'm going to address it first. The plot is quite important, But in a tabletop role-playing game, it must also be quite flexible, because if you're writing a book or if you're writing a story, the plot is king. You're the one that's in charge of the entire plot. If you're writing a book, a static book, you decide where the plot goes. But in the progress of an adventure involving other players, the plot is going to change because those players are unpredictable. If you set the plot too much in stone, they're going to feel railroaded. They're going to feel you're not giving them any opportunity to branch out and be creative. And that in and of itself is going to encourage them to do drastic things to derail it and bring your own decision of where the plot's going to go out of your hands again. So what I do is I keep a general outline of the plot I would like to see, but also notes about how certain events might unfold if the characters do something unexpected. And they will always, at least one point in one session or other, do something unexpected. And it may not even be on purpose. Maybe most of the time, I'm going to take that back. It's not all the time they're going to do this, but most of the time they're going to do something unexpected. They may misunderstand something and make a completely off the wall decision, unintentionally or even intentionally, if they completely understand it but decide just to be assholes, or not necessarily assholes, but just decide to be contrary and decide to go off on their own. And yes, some of them are going to be assholes, but some of them may just decide to be contrary, just to see if you've written something that they can deal with if they decide not to take the bait and go off in this direction when you wanted them to go that direction. It may be that they misunderstood something that you said. Oh, look, like the old gazebo story, and if you've never heard that one, it's floating around the internet. Look up I Attack the Gazebo. They may fail to put pieces together. You may lead a trail of breadcrumbs of clues that will point them in the direction of the plot, and they may fail to find them. And they may fail to find them because they're not looking, because they're not paying attention, or because they've rolled so poorly that the incorrect outcome is unavoidable. Maybe they spend the entire session, and this happened to me, maybe they just spend the entire session searching and searching and searching, and the dice just don't cooperate. Every time they look after a lead, they fail their diplomacy. Every time they try to search a room, they fail their search check. Every time they try to confront somebody, they roll poorly in combat and the person gets away or whatever. And at some point in those situations, the only way you get them back on the plot is to directly intervene. You just put your head in your hand. You say, "Okay, you guys are rolling shit tonight." A peasant walks up to you and gives you what you need to know to get to the next section. Sometimes that's got to happen if you want them to stay on the plot. But generally speaking, the more flexible you make the plot, the more adaptive it's going to be to the players. The more adaptive it's going to be to the players, the more they're going to enjoy it, because they've got agency. They're not just characters that you're moving along as if you controlled the entire party. You can always, if the plot takes a turn you didn't expect, you can always try to guide it back to the main thread later on. You can let them get sidetracked for a while, do whatever they need to do, whatever they feel they need to do, and then come up with a way to bring them back to the main plot later on. All you got to do is understand the character's motivations at that point. As for the complexity of the plot, if you're not making a published adventure, then you're designing it for your players. You need to know your players good enough to decide what's going to interest them. Some groups are going to enjoy complex epics that unfold like they're in a novel and they're the main characters of a grand political scheme. Some of the characters, all you got to do is say, "Hey, you guys are adventurers, you're nearly broke, there's a ruined castle you hear about. There's tales of fortune found in the vaults." Bam, that's their plot. They go there to plunder the vaults to make enough to continue their lavish lifestyle of drinking and wenches. And that suits some groups perfectly fine, and there is nothing wrong with that. A lot of people will sneer at that. But hey, that can be fun. That can be fun for some groups. It's perfectly fine. Don't need to go ahead and trash on them. At some point, there's a point you want to develop. If you've got any clues that are necessary to unfold the plot, if it's a murder mystery, actual clues, if it's just some sort of exploration, then things that are going to point the characters to look in certain areas, then this is the point at which you want to develop those clues. This is the point you want to go ahead and make a list, just like you did earlier, of things that you want the characters to find they're going to point them in the direction of the plot. Things like books that detail the villain's plans, or things like histories of the area that they can gather from the local peasantry. A good rule of thumb is that in each step, especially if you're designing the adventure around a mystery or other investigation, each step should have at least 3 clues in that particular step that lead to the next step. They should all be hidden in different ways. And that gives the party the chance to uncover at least one of them in their explorations. They may not, they may just be screwed, but the three clues per plot step, or three clues per plot section and plot progression, means that you've got a chance that they're at least going to continue to go forward. Even if so-and-so botches his search roll, you may find a captive that knows the story as well. Something to point them in the right direction. So, it not only does it give us a certain redundancy to allow people to go ahead even in the face of poor dice rolls, but by hiding them in different ways, it gives everybody in the party something to do. Because some adventurers just rely on the rogue finding everything, whereas if you put the clues in different forms, well, one step the rogue may find some notes by searching a place, but then in the next step the wizard may decide, the wizard may find a clue in books that they took down to research spells, and then in another step, the warrior may intimidate somebody such that they go ahead and spill the beans. So each time it gives a different character in the group something to do to advance the plot. Now, related to the plot is the plot hook, or the adventure hook. It's the simplest element of the adventure's design, and yet it's the most important. It is the start of the plot, or it can be something completely unrelated to the plot, but something that gets the player characters in the right place at the right time in order to involve them in the proper adventure. The reason it is so important because without the adventure hook, without something to get the player started, they're not going to start. How direct or how subtle that particular hook is can vary based on the adventure and the players and their characters. If you're dealing with a good party that, not necessarily the alignment good, but a solid experienced group that wants to adventure, they're going to give you some leeway in how you get your characters involved. They're not going to be contrary just for the sake of being contrary. And if they are being contrary just for the sake of being contrary, you can try to go ahead and have some flexibility in that plot hook to try and reel them in. And if they're contrary after that, let their ass sit outside while the rest of the adventures go on. And you can say, okay, well, you drink beer in the tavern for the next session. And that'll, if they're too contrary, I've got no problem doing that. I know a lot of people don't. But I know a lot of people will bend over backwards to get everybody involved. But if I've got the plot hooks out there, and 3 of the 4 characters are ready to go, and that one person decides, oh, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to sit there in the tavern and spend my entire time flirting with barmaids. I go, sure thing, man. You enjoy that. The rest of you go ahead and go on the adventure. So, but then again, I'm kind of a bastard that way. Now, if an adventure is part of an existing campaign, a lot of times the adventure hooks are built in. I mean, the characters already know from previous efforts where they can go, and it's easy to throw a new adventure in, even if it wasn't initially planned. Perhaps outstanding debts are owed to an NPC, and that NPC requests the character's service, or maybe a clue found in a previous adventure, like a treasure map or something, finally gets deciphered, and they decide to go after it. Or maybe, the characters might even have family members that write them saying, "Oh, I need help," so they can go ahead and get drawn in that way. Pre-existing campaign, easy to do adventure hooks on. For the first adventure of a campaign, or a one-shot, or a standalone adventure, plot hooks, you can put them in, and you can be real obvious about it, because, as I said, if a group really wants to play, they'll understand that you have to rope them in somehow, and they're usually more than willing to take the bait. If the artist in you decides, it has to be real subtle, do it if you want, but just understand that if you make an adventure hook too subtle, the player characters may miss it. If you were involved with a character creation, let's say you were overseeing the character creation, and the characters are all nice and laid out, even if it's not a returning thing, even if they just made their characters prior in the day, then their backgrounds. Hopefully you know a little bit about the character's background, so you can use that in the design process to design the adventure hook tailored to that character. And that is the best case scenario. It's the absolute best case scenario, because nothing brings a player character in like an adventure hook specifically tailored for them. But it's going to vary based on your group, but you're going to need an adventure hook. It's a great place for creativity. Now, once you've got your plot and your character hooks, then you want to look at your antagonists. An adventurer's antagonist is actually often the star, the seed of the adventure, in a lot of cases. That's definitely not always the case. In many older dungeon crawl style adventures and so on and so forth, the antagonists were secondary to the experience of the setting. But in just as many of them, the antagonist was the draw. Strahd von Zarovic, great antagonist, a great draw for the great star of the adventure. Halaster Blackcloak, great character, although in his particular case, it could be argued that Undermountain is the actual star of that particular adventure. But where was I going? Oh yeah, the antagonist is usually the main villain, but it's not necessarily always the main villain. The antagonist is merely someone or something that challenges the character's progress. A major villain certainly fits the bill, but so would an organization that works against the characters. In some cases, even the local law enforcement of the character's home base may function as an antagonist, either maliciously, such as like in a corrupt settlement or when characters have outstanding warrants or things like that, or unintentionally, such as in a settlement with laws that are well-intentioned, but they're implemented that they put a character at a disadvantage in their dealings, or the law might be incompetent and get in the character's way more than other minor villains. Nature itself can be an antagonist. Perhaps the characters are merely hired to escort somebody from one place to another, and all that stands in their way is a stretch of harsh terrain and deadly storms. In that case, nature itself can be the antagonist. It kind of blends in with setting, but you can actually set nature up as a separate force from the setting and use that to challenge the characters. The most important part to remember is that even if your setting is the main focus of the adventure, you still need some sort of obstacles for the party to overcome, or else it's just a downtime session. It doesn't have to be combat. It can be a skill challenge. It can be, a session, an adventure where they have to talk to a lot of people and discover clues. Must be some sort of challenge for them to overcome, or else you may as well just roll it into a downtime event. Now, after you've got the antagonist fleshed out, then you look at allies. And allies can be, they're optional. They're not necessarily for every adventure, but they do spice up the adventure. The allies are characters that can assist the players in some way. They can be critical in overcoming certain challenges. They can serve as a rest point and protect the party while they recover. If you have any of the allies that are intertwined with the main plot line, then the first pass is where you want to jot down their details and their intended place in the story and what they can offer the group, where they'll appear, and so on and so forth. An ally may not necessarily even be a combat-related ally. They can be a barmaid that offers a critical clue, or a priest that gives the party their blessing, or even a merchant that sells wares and the party has to pay for them, but they're wares that are immediately applicable to the weaknesses of enemies they could encounter. And that merchant, even though you're paying him, he's an ally because you're making a fair trade and getting something that you could not get. It's going to make your adventure a lot easier. Not all adventures need allies, as I said, but in those where they fit, they can be a nice touch in rounding the world out. And you want to do it in this part of the adventure design. That way you've got an idea of where you want to put them, and that can be rolled into the next element, which is the setting. The last major aspect to sketch out. And at least if you haven't used it as your adventure seat, it's the last major place to sketch out. And even if you have, this is the part where you detail it. The setting is the local setting. It's where the adventure takes place. It can be a valley, a particular village, the dungeons that the characters explore, an island chain, even just a small section of a city or buildings that are pertinent to the story can be the setting. I leave this until last simply because once you've got everything else done, you know that you need to put in certain places in that setting to put those people. You know that you're going to have to, if you've got allies that are barmaids, or the allies that are bartenders, or allies that are blacksmiths, you know you're going to have to either have an inn or a blacksmith. If you've got a villain that rules a castle, you're going to need a castle. So at this point, you get to sketch the setting out. And this is where you can sketch out maps, or if you're pretty confident, you can go ahead and do the highly detailed maps. But this is where you start laying out your maps and your layout. I generally start when I'm designing a map, whether it be for a valley, a hidden valley with villages and such, or whether it be a dungeon map. I generally start out with a flowchart. And this lets me arrange where everything needs to be. And in that flowchart, each section of that flowchart, I go ahead and write who can be found there, what can be found there, and then I connect them with lines, and it gives me a very abstract overhead view of things that shows how they're connected and allows me to make changes as necessary. And then, once I'm pretty sure where everybody needs to be, that's when I start doing the maps of each section and layout. If you've got a flowchart and you've got, say, a mega dungeon, then that'll also let you know how to make those maps connect with other maps. So it's very useful for making sure you've got all the categories we've talked about so far covered. Now, once you've got the setting fleshed out, you're satisfied with all the general categories above, it's time to revise things. Just like in writing, you want to do a second draft. You don't have to rewrite everything, but you want to do a second draft where you look over everything and make sure all the pieces fit together, make sure there's multiple pathways for the characters to take. They don't have to be wildly different paths, but even a few alternate methods to overcome various obstacles in their way will make the players feel less railroaded, even if both pathways lead to the same place. If you have to make any changes to the overall structure, the work that you've done thus far is going to make it easier to identify what changes you need to make. Is generally the place where it becomes pretty obvious if you need to make a major change. By the end of the first quick revision phase, you should have a pretty clear idea of what will happen at what points in the adventure, where things are, where everybody is settled, how everybody interacts, as well as potential exit points should the party decide to just go with something completely different. I've had characters decide, we can't handle this adventure, we're going to bail. And I've included in my design, okay, well, if you want to just leave, if you want to straight up bail, you can do it. And these are the points at which they can do it. And I've written them down in my notes. So it's not a major concern because a lot of people will just go and hit that adventure until they get through it. If you're running an ongoing storyline, or if the players just aren't having as much fun with the adventure as you thought they would, it's good to let them have an exit, or else they're going to hate you for it, or they just may not stop, or just may stop playing whatsoever. So once you got a few revisions, once you're done with a couple revision passes, just one or two can work. Then you're looking at a virtually finished adventure. Now it's for the detailing pass, and after you're happy with how the adventure is structured, you've got everything going, then you do the fine details. Not necessary for a lot of one-shots, but especially if you're looking to making this a major adventure or publishing or something, this is where you do the detail pass. This is where you double-check what you've done. Make sure that everybody's names are everybody, like the character names make sense. Make sure that anybody who's going to be involved in combat, you get their stats together. In Dungeons and Dragons, you make sure you've got the difficulty classes or the DCs at the very least for the walls, the doors, the locks, the traps, so that you don't have to go looking through and flipping through books. If you've got treasure hoards, make sure you've got them figured out already, so you don't have to roll them on the fly. It's always useful to do treasure hoards before you don't roll the treasure after you've defeated the villain, because if your villain's got, or not necessarily a villain, if they're fighting something and there's something in their treasure hoard that they could use, well, they're probably going to use it. I mean, if I'm sitting here and somebody busts in my door and I got a sword +5 here, I'm not going to go after them with my fist. I'm going to grab that fucking sword. So, do your treasures during your detail phase, just so you know that if the shit hits the fan, that there's stuff there in the horde that they might be able to use. If you've got spellcasters, make sure the spells books are detailed. If you've got, other things that have special abilities, like an option of different special abilities, make sure you've got the options all detailed. If you want to have random encounter tables and wandering monsters, this is a good place to make the tables. You already know what other encounters the characters are going to encounter. So you can balance out what you put in the random tables with what you're expecting to face. Hell, you can even tie your random encounters with the existing quests and NPCs. You can make, and I've seen this done in the past, you can make it so that a character is walking. If you've got a named creature in a particular hall, you can put them on the random encounter table, because they're not going to sit there waiting for the PCs. I had a character run into a named goblin boss in a hallway outside of his lair, because the goblin was not going to stand there, in his throne room the entire time the PCs were coming. He's going to walk around, he's going to grab some snacks, he's going to go use the bathroom, whatever. He's going to be found in the halls from time to time. So it can be useful to throw shit like that into the encounter tables. If you're using a system that has stat lines, and stat lines are basically a quick notation of the monster statistics, so that you don't have to go flipping through rule books or looking it up in tables, jot them down during the detail section. Go ahead and put them either in a chart at the end or in the room description itself. If you're working from a map setting. It can be a different set of notes, just a stack of notes with nothing but the stats of various monsters they can encounter. That way you only have to have one copy of them. Just so long as they're there, just so long as you can speed play in any way you can without looking back to the rulebooks. Finally, after you got all that, do any other bookkeeping you need to do. Get any battle maps, tokens, reference cards, whatever set up. But this is really the portion that's not adventure design anymore, but just general adventure preparation. And that's a topic for another time. At the end of all this, congratulations, you got yourself an adventure. As I've said before, there's as many ways to make adventures as there are DMs. It's just generally the way I make mine. It's the way I approach mine. At least when I have time to go through every step. There have been many instances where I've had to throw an adventure together and I've had no time to do this design process. I have to say that the adventures that I put through this design process are the ones that my players give me compliments on, saying, "Oh, that was such a great adventure." So keep that in mind. If you're going to put an adventure together, your players are going to be able to tell if you threw it together in your head on the fly. And I'm not saying that's a bad skill to have. It's a great skill to have. But you'll find that players appreciate preparation. As you craft more adventures, you'll find specific techniques that'll help with one particular type of adventure or another that I've included here. I could go on forever with those. As you make more adventures, you'll learn techniques that suit you best because your particular style of doing things as it leans towards one way or another. Or you can develop your own ways. I equally steal and or come up with my own ideas all the time. As with everything, practice is going to make perfect. The more adventures you design, the better they're going to come out with. I hope that this video has helped those who have been watching it, who are new to designing role-playing adventures. I understand if you're a long-time dungeon master and you're thinking, hey, I know all that stuff already, or my way is way better. I'm not going to say this is the best way. By all means, it's probably not the best way. It is, however, the way that suits me best at the moment. And I've been running games for almost 30 years, since I was a little kid. And to this day, I'm constantly learning new tips and tricks. Just remember, the moment you stop learning is the moment you stop living. And on that, I'm going to leave it there. For now, this has been the RPG Crawler with Tabletops and Taverns. If you like what you've seen, remember to like. Comment if you want to share your own tips and tricks on adventure design, or have particular questions about specific techniques that you'd like me to answer. And subscribe for more RPG content. Until next time, take care and goodbye.